I'm Anne Mossop from the Sydney Opera House, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon for Hello Robots with Martin Ford. So this afternoon's session is going to be about how the rise of robots has the potential to transform the way we live and work. Researchers estimate that almost half of all jobs will be automated in the next 20 years. The rise of robots is happening, and it's going to transform our economies. Intelligent machines are taking over increasingly skilled jobs using machine learning to automate even sophisticated processes and activities. Does this jobless future herald a disaster for unskilled workers, or will it enable humans to lead more fulfilling lives? This is something that we've talked about for many, many years, the idea that machines would transform our lives for the better. Martin Ford has written a fascinating book on this topic, and we're going to be talking about what really is happening in the world of automation and robotics, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, whether the singularity is actually near or an overhyped fantasy, and how these kinds of changes will have an impact on our economies and the likelihood of increasing inequality. Martin Ford is the founder of a Silicon Valley-based software development firm and the author of 2 books. The first is The Lights in the Tunnel, Automation, Accelerating Technology and the Economy of the Future. The most recent book is the New York Times best-selling Rise of the Robots, Technology and the Threat of a Jobless Future. Martin has over 25 years' experience in the fields of computer design and software, and has a computer engineering degree from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and a graduate business degree from the University of California, Los Angeles. The topic of robots is something that has been around for a while. A very much-read report from 2 researchers at the Martin Centre at Oxford University came up with the statistic that 50% of our jobs are going to have vanished in the next 20 years. So this is the kind of question that set us looking for someone to come and talk about this dangerous idea. Martin's work really brings together an understanding of the nature of that technology and what it means. But what is very special about his perspective is that he's able to bring that together with a sophisticated understanding of how our economies can and may work. So please join me in welcoming Martin Ford.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and really a privilege to be associated with this remarkable festival. What I'd like to talk about today is an idea that I think is genuinely dangerous and perhaps a little bit alarming. And of course, it is the idea that robots and other smart machines are eventually going to displace a great many workers and take over a lot of jobs in the economy. This is something that I've been thinking about for at least 5 or 6 years now. I've written a couple of books on the subject, and I've come to the conclusion that we could well be at the leading edge of a sort of a massive disruptive wave that could eventually put just a terrific amount of stress on our economy and on society. And one of the things that's been really remarkable is how this issue has gained visibility over the last few years. When I wrote my first book on this back in 2009, this issue was completely off the radar. It was almost, you might say, kind of a lunatic fringe type idea. But over the past few years, it's really gained a tremendous amount of traction, and there have been books published, there have been academic studies done, and there's just a ton of stuff in the media. You can't really look at a newspaper or go online without seeing something about robots and often the potential impact on jobs nowadays. So it's getting a great deal of visibility, and I think that there is kind of an emerging concern among the public about this issue. But at the same time, there is a very conventional view about all of this and how it works. And the conventional view says that while technology may disrupt certain industries, it may even upend industries completely and destroy lots of jobs, and it may threaten certain occupations and eliminate certain types of work, it will also create new things. It will create entirely new industries, and those industries, of course, will employ people. And it will also create new types of works, new roles for workers, new occupations, and oftentimes things that we previously might not have been able to imagine. So that's the conventional view, that generally progress is quite positive for workers, that it creates better opportunities, opportunities that might require higher skill levels, and opportunities that in general might pay higher wages than those that have come in the past. And it must be said that the historical narrative generally supports this conventional view. This idea that machines might displace workers and potentially create a lot of unemployment is by no means new. It goes back at a minimum 200 years to the Luddite revolts in England. And since that time, this topic has come up again and again. And the thing is that it's always been a false alarm. In my latest book, I talk a little bit about the Triple Revolution Report, which is actually a very formal report put together by a very smart group of people, including 2 Nobel laureates in the United States, and it was presented to the Johnson administration, and this was back in 1964, about 50 years ago. And this report warned that the United States was really on the brink of a massive disruption, that there was going to be massive unemployment, and that it was all going to come about because of industrial automation. And so there was really a tremendous amount of concern about this. But again, this is 50 years ago. Obviously, that didn't happen. And in fact, that's what we've seen again and again, is that this concern has been raised, but the economy has adapted. New jobs have been created, or new industries have appeared to employ people, and progress overall has been a positive thing. And so I think that there's a lot in common between this particular industry, or this particular issue, and the story of the little boy who cries wolf. In that story, of course, the false alarm is raised again and again, and eventually the population becomes skeptical and they become complacent. But it's important to remember that in the end of that story, the wolf does show up, and then it doesn't go so well for the people that were skeptical. And my concern is that we may be headed to that kind of an outcome here. So while history generally supports the idea that progress has been positive for most workers, I can point to at least one class of worker for whom the story has been very different. For these workers, technological progress has really not had anything positive for them. Technology has completely decimated their work. It has completely eliminated their jobs, and there really have been no new opportunities at all for those workers. And the workers I'm talking about, of course, are horses. And if you look at peak horse employment in the United States, in 1915, there were about 22 million horses. And by 1960, the number of horses in the United States had collapsed to about 3 million. So obviously, that was not a good thing. So the question I want to present to you is it possible that human workers could face a similar fate? Something similar could happen to our human workforce. And I'm not obviously talking about people actually disappearing the way horses did, but in terms of their work evaporating. Now, you may have a very powerful and almost reflexive reaction to that. You may say that that's absurd. How can you compare people to horses? I mean, horses are obviously very limited. They can only do a certain number of specific things. And in fact, when cars and trucks and tractors came along, and those machines were more efficient and more effective at doing basically everything that horses could do, then horses had nowhere to turn. They had no other options. And that's why their work has disappeared. Human beings, on the other hand, are, of course, intelligent. We have the ability to learn, to adapt. And in theory, human beings are infinitely adaptable. We can learn to do new things and move into new areas. And you might argue, I think quite rationally, that that characteristic guarantees that people will always have work, because we will always be able to find something new to do. And I think that that's obviously a correct comparison. But here's the thing to understand. While it's true that humans are obviously dramatically different from horses, it is also true that the machines which will threaten the jobs of people in the future are dramatically different from the machines that displaced horses. And perhaps the most important difference, the thing that sets apart the machines we have today, is that those machines increasingly have the ability to learn and to adapt. And what that means is that technology today is no longer just displacing people in particular jobs or in particular industries or taking over specific things. It's really beginning to encroach on the fundamental quality that really sets us apart as a species, and on the fundamental quality that so far has allowed people to stay ahead of the march of technology. So I think that that's something to really think about. We may be looking at something that is really genuinely different. And you know, this is an idea that I think kind of sits at the intersection of economics and technology. And economists as a group never really want to hear that this time is different. They're always extremely skeptical about that. On the other hand, in the realm of technology, this time is always different. That's the whole point of innovation. We're always trying to go to some place that we haven't been to before. That's the whole nature of progress. And so I think perhaps one of the fundamental questions here is this really a subject that is mostly about economics, or is it about technology? And I tend to come down on the technology side. I think that there is no universal law of the universe or even of economics that says that people will always have to be part of the loop. There is nothing that says that human beings must always be essential to the production process. I think it's fairly easy to imagine a future where smart machines are able to take over a great deal of the work that's actually demanded by the economy as it produces the goods and the services that we want. So given that it's kind of a dangerous idea to propose that this time is really different and that is always going to be subject to a lot of skepticism, I think it's really important to articulate what exactly is different about this particular technology that we have today and why it's dramatically different from what we've seen in the past. And I would point generally to three things that really set this technology apart. The first thing is that we've got this exponential acceleration going on. I think most people have heard of Moore's law, which basically says that computing power doubles roughly every 2 years or 18 months. But it's actually much broader than that. It's not just about increasing hardware capability. It actually, in many cases, we see acceleration in software. We see it in terms of communications bandwidth and so forth. But the really important thing to focus on is not just the fact that we have this doubling going on, but rather that it's been going on for so long now. In fact, it's been going on for decades. You can think of this in terms of getting into your car and starting out at about 5 miles per hour or so, and then gradually doubling your speed. If you were able to do that a handful of times, you would need a racetrack and a better car, probably. If you could do it 27 or 30 times, which is roughly the number of times that we've seen information technology double in power since maybe the late 1950s, when the first integrated circuits came into being, you would be traveling at millions of miles per hour. You would be a spaceship. You would be capable of getting to Mars perhaps in just a few minutes. And that's where we stand today in terms of the amount of absolute progress that is happening now relative to what we saw in the past. And that's why I think that things are going to unfold at a very rapid and often very surprising rate. We're going to see things develop that really, in some cases, astonish us. And it's largely driven by the fact that we're now moving so rapidly because this exponential doubling has been going on for so long. The second quality that I would point to is, of course, this fact that machines are now taking on this cognitive capability. This is the point I was making when I was talking about horses. Machines, in a limited sense, can now think. They can solve problems. They can make decisions. They can figure things out. Most importantly, they can learn. And we now have smart algorithms, machine learning algorithms, which are able to churn through data and based on that, make predictions. And I think that machine learning, more than anything else, is the technology that is really just kind of central to this. It's just incredibly important and powerful. And to sort of visualize the impact of that, you might think in terms of whether another smart person might be able to learn to do your job by looking at a very detailed record of everything you've done in the past. If a smart person could do that, then it's probably a pretty good bet that someday there'll be an algorithm that might employ essentially the same technique and learn to do that job. And of course, the algorithm might be even more efficient than a person would be. So that gives you a sense of how many jobs out there are really going to be susceptible to this. And I think that it's ultimately going to be a great number. The third thing that's really important to understand is that this technology is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. It's what we now call a general purpose technology. It's quite different, for example, from the specialized mechanical technologies that transformed agriculture and eliminated millions of jobs on farms. Those were specialized. They hit one particular area of the economy. Today, what we see is much more generalized. Information technology is going to impact across the board. It's going to impact every single industry, every business, every organization, every part of the economy. And what that means is that there really isn't any safe haven. There isn't a place where this technology is not going to have an impact where workers will be, forever safe from it. It's just across the board. So when you put all those things together, I think what you end up with is something that really looks a bit like a utility. It's almost like electricity, except that instead of just delivering electric power, it's actually delivering machine intelligence. It's delivering this ability to solve problems and make decisions and figure things out. And that capability is going to scale across our whole economy, across every organization. And one implication of it is that it's going to make everything less labor intensive. It's going to mean fewer opportunities, especially for what we might think of as average people with average capability. And I think that that's something that's really going to have dramatic consequences in the future. So the point I've been making so far is how information technology is going to scale across our existing industries. But one thing that people who are a bit skeptical will rightly point out is that there is this ongoing process of creative destruction, that while things may be disrupted as they exist today, there will always be new things being created. We know that there will be important new industries that will arise in the future, and it's easy to imagine what some of those will be. You can think in terms of nanotechnology, synthetic biology, virtual reality. These will all be really important things, no doubt about it. But I think there is a lot of evidence to suggest is that while they'll be important, powerful, influential industries, they simply will not employ large numbers of people. They won't be very labor intensive. And what I'm showing here on this slide is a comparison that I think kind of illustrates that based on what we've seen so far. You see General Motors, as a traditional employer, had a peak employment of about 840,000 workers. Google, years later, had actually 20% more in terms of inflation-adjusted earnings, but they employed just a tiny number of people, less than 5% of the number of workers. And of course, the quality of those workers was also quite different. General Motors created opportunities for lots and lots of average people. Google employs people who are, very elite, very skilled, with extraordinary capabilities. So there's really a big difference in both the number of jobs and who those jobs are going to be accessible to in terms of General Motors versus Google. And the point I'm making is that the whole future economy, I think, will look a lot more like Google and a lot less like General Motors. So new things will emerge, but they will use this technology right from the get-go. They'll be built on a foundation of this information technology, and as a result, they're simply not going to be very labor intensive. What you see here, what you see here is another take on this idea of creative destruction, or creative destruction, and it's looking, rather than in terms of industries, in terms of occupations. One of the things that you hear very often, almost to the point that it's almost become a cliche, I hear it so often, is that if you go back 100 years or 50 years, the people then would not have been able to imagine all these new incredible jobs that we have today. And of course, there are many examples of that you can give. You can talk about website designers and social media marketers and data scientists and so forth. These are all jobs that exist today that people in the past would not have been able to imagine. But what I'm really showing here is that while those jobs absolutely exist and they get lots and lots of attention, they are pretty few in number. There are not a lot of them. And it turns out that in the United States, for example, about 90% of our workforce is actually engaged in occupations that existed 100 years ago. I mean, it's traditional areas. It's working in retail stores. It's driving vehicles. It's working in food preparation and service. It's working in factories. It's working in offices, doing general office clerical type work. These are all professions that existed 100 years ago, and that's nearly everyone works there. Whereas these new things are really quite a small percentage. So what the risk we face going forward is that information technology is really going to disrupt these traditional occupations, and we're talking about literally tens of millions of workers there that are going to be impacted. On the other hand, there absolutely will be new things created, but as you see here, they're not going to be large in number. So it's kind of hard for me to believe that there are going to be enough new opportunities created to really absorb those millions and millions of workers. And there's also may well be a skill match issue in terms that the new things created will require lots of education and skill, and a great many average people simply may not be particularly well equipped to move into those opportunities, even to the extent that they exist. So this is sort of, I think, a good sense of the disruption that may be coming. So let me review with you a couple slides that show some of the actual economic evidence from the United States that shows kind of what has been going on. And what you see here is a slide that compares productivity with compensation for average workers. Now, productivity is economic output, the value of what you create, divided by the number of hours it takes to produce that. So it's essentially a measure of efficiency. And the historical narrative has always been that technological progress results in better tools that make workers more efficient, more productive, and so that they can produce more. And the story is, and if you pick up any economics textbook, it will tell you that the way it is supposed to work is that as productivity increases, wages increase in lockstep with that, so that increasing progress and increasing productivity makes everyone better off. Workers see the results of that progress in the form of higher wages, and that sort of scales across the whole economy and makes everyone better off. And what you see on this graph is that that is exactly how it worked right up until around 1973. You see those two lines starting around the end of World War II up until the mid-1970s are just almost perfectly correlated, and that's just textbook the way it is supposed to work. But around 1972 or 73, something happened. You see that those two lines effectively decouple. You see that wages or compensation for average people is now completely flat. And in fact, in the United States, certain groups of workers, after adjusting for inflation, now make even less than they made in the mid-1970s. But at the same time, productivity has continued its upward climb. It's been pretty relentless. So what this slide is really showing is that, in effect, the fruits of innovation and of progress are no longer being distributed to average workers. Instead, all the fruits of innovation are accruing to the people that own businesses and in fact own these smarter machines. All the progress is being hoovered up by the people at the top, by business owners, executives, and investors, and so forth. So it's really quite a strong indication that something is happening, a structural change is happening, and I believe that a big part of it is the fact that machines are becoming more autonomous. In fact, they're moving from being tools that used to make workers more valuable and therefore enabled workers to demand higher wages. They're transforming into being instead absolute workers. They're actually substituting for workers, and in some cases actually making those workers less valuable instead of more valuable. This is what job creation looks like in the United States, starting back in the 1960s. And you can see that this graph looks almost like a declining staircase. You can, starting in the 1960s, going forward decade by decade, almost every decade, in percentage terms, there have been fewer jobs created. So clearly, again, this is an indication that there's some kind of a structural change going on that indicates that the economy is just getting less effective at creating jobs. This first decade of this century was just a complete disaster. There were actually no new jobs at all created. And that is largely due because of this massive financial crisis and recession that we had. But you can see, if you look at the last visible bar on this graph, you can see that even up to 2007, which is roughly when the financial crisis began, it doesn't look good. So we were basically on track for another miserable performance, even if the financial crisis had not occurred. So I think this is, again, a strong indication that there's some structural change happening in the economy, and I really think that technology has a lot to do with that. This graph almost looks like the mirror image of that one, and this is showing our experience with what we call jobless recoveries. And what has been happening in the United States is that every time we hit a recession, and of course we have a downturn, and then millions of jobs are typically lost during a recession, but it is taking longer and longer for the economy and the job market to spring back, to get back to where it was before. And you can see how these are just kind of stretching out, and it's almost as though the economy is kind of losing its elasticity, its ability to spring back from a recession. It's getting harder and harder to get back. And you can see that this last jobless recovery was just a monster. It was just Actually, from the beginning of the financial crisis was about 6 years before the economy returned to the same employment level. So it was just, an epic jobless recovery. Aside from the fact that it's taken longer for the jobs to come back, there's also something else important happening, and that is that the quality of the jobs is actually changing. In other words, the jobs that disappear are actually not the same as the jobs that eventually return. And what's happening is that when a recession hits, the first jobs to get wiped out are really the good middle-class jobs. These are the jobs that require a moderate level of skill and are generally accessible to most people in the population, and nonetheless pay a good middle-class income, and very often they involve doing relatively routine things. What we see is that when the recession happens and businesses begin to cut back, the first thing they do is kill off all those jobs. So the good jobs disappear, and then when things finally do recover, after longer and longer periods, the jobs that reappear are predominantly of lower quality. They're more likely to be low-wage jobs, often in the service sector, areas like fast food, areas like working in retail stores. Quite often these are part-time jobs. They come with minimal benefits and so forth. So they're really not in any way as desirable as those good middle-class jobs that got wiped out. So we see those lower wage jobs coming back in large numbers, and then a smaller number of better jobs, but those jobs really require lots of education, at a minimum a college or university degree, and very often even much more than that, very often even a graduate degree. So the good jobs are there, but they're not currently in huge numbers, and they're really not necessarily accessible to large sections of our population. So you can really see how, again, there's a structural change happening in our economy. So let me talk a bit about some of the actual innovations that are really having an impact here. Robots, of course, have been around for a long time, and robots have been in factories for decades. We've had industrial robots, but they have always been very highly dependent on timing and positioning. They've been what you might call tightly choreographed. An industrial robot expects a particular part to be in the right place at the right time, and it's able to pick that part up with extraordinarily speed and dexterity and so forth, and do something with it. And of course, that's extraordinarily efficient in terms of rote repetitive type jobs. And that's why in advanced countries in manufacturing, nearly all of the absolutely repetitive manufacturing jobs are already being taken over by robots. But the jobs that have been left for people have been those that are on some level unpredictable. And in particular, it's jobs that require visual perception and human dexterity and hand-eye coordination, where you might go into an unpredictable, unlighted environment and based on visual perception be able to do tasks. But what we're seeing is that the robots are now coming after that work as well. And what you see here is a picture of a robot that's built by a company called Industrial Perception in Silicon Valley. And this is a startup company, but it's actually now owned by Google. Google bought it last year. And this company focuses specifically on building a robot that can move boxes. And you see it here in this picture, approaching a stack of boxes. You'll notice that the boxes are different shapes and sizes. They're kind of in a jumble. They're not stacked precisely. The environment where these boxes are may not be particularly well lighted. And this is a challenge that up until recently would have been beyond robots. It would have been something reserved exclusively for human beings. But they've built a machine that can use machine vision to actually look at this stack of boxes and then go about moving them. And they project that eventually this machine will be able to move about a box every second, and that would compare with a box every 6 seconds or so for a particularly productive human worker. And of course, this is a machine that can work continuously. It's not going to get tired. It's not going to get injured. It's not going to file a workers' compensation claim. So you can really see how, as this unfolds, it's going to be quite disruptive, and human beings are not going to be able to compete in this area. Now, there is also a very conventional view about this, and it says that, hey, this is not a bad thing. I mean, this is a lousy job. If you're working on the loading dock, moving boxes, you're very likely to get injured. Many people end up getting disabled doing this kind of work. So if a machine can do that, it's all pretty good. And economists will in particular talk about these workers being freed up and able then to move on to something else. And the conventional idea has always been that if you lose your job on the loading dock or in a warehouse or whatever, then what you should do is you should go back to school, or you should get some more training, and then you'll be able to move up the skills ladder. You'll hopefully end up with a better job and a better environment. Instead of doing something that might result in injury, perhaps you'll be working in an office, sitting at a desk in a much more comfortable environment, doing something more meaningful, doing something that hopefully will pay a higher wage. And that's the whole idea of how things are supposed to work. This is the problem with that. This is actually a story that appeared just a month or two ago in the Wall Street Journal, and it's talking about the corporate finance departments in very large corporations. A corporate finance department would be people who are engaged in things like accounting, financial planning, accounts payable and receivable, and so forth. And what this graph shows is that in the past decade, the head count, or the number of people employed in those departments in the largest corporation, relative to the revenue of those corporations, has collapsed by about 40%. So, nearly half of those jobs have evaporated over the last decade, and it is all because of smart software that is eliminating those jobs. And at present, I think that it's largely more routine jobs, especially in areas like accounts payable and receivable and so forth. But there are many examples we can point to where machines are really coming aggressively after a lot of this white-collar work. And this, again, is really driven to a large extent by machine learning, this remarkable technology where algorithms can churn through data and learn things. One good example is in the field of law. There are now smart algorithms that do document review. There used to be lots and lots of jobs for lawyers and paralegals to review documents. They would go through big cardboard boxes full of paper documents, look at each one, figure out which ones were relevant to a court case and which ones had to be provided to the other side in the discovery process. Not exciting work, but it was important, routine work for lawyers and paralegals. Now much of that is automated through e-discovery software that does all of this using machine learning and does it completely automated. Another important area is journalism. There are some of the largest media companies are now utilizing algorithms which can autonomously generate news stories. In fact, by one account, every 30 seconds or so, there is a new news story put online that is generated completely autonomously. Now, at present, a lot of this is in the more formulaic areas. For example, it's in financial reporting or it's in sports reporting. But the capability is getting better and better. It already goes far beyond simply plugging numbers into some absolutely formulaic format. These are systems that are able to look at a data stream, analyze that data, figure out what's particularly important or particularly interesting, and then they can weave that together into a fairly compelling narrative that is actually, in many cases, competitive to what a human writer can do. And they can then automatically, just in seconds, generate a news story. And this is something that is going to go far beyond journalism into many other types of white-collar jobs. You can imagine any kind of a white-collar, knowledge-based worker who sits in front of a desk doing some relatively formulaic routine thing, generating the same report or the same analysis again and again for presentation to management, for example. These types of machine learning technologies are really going to threaten a very large numbers of those jobs. So this is one of the most important things to keep in mind, is that the skilled jobs are now also being threatened, and that kind of upends our conventional solution to all of this, which has always been the idea that you need to retrain people. If they lose their unskilled job, you retrain them so that they can move up that skills ladder. But clearly, the machines are proving to be quite adept at also climbing that skills ladder. And as it turns out, a knowledge-based job can often be actually easier and cheaper to automate than a more manipulative job, because it really requires only software. It's just a computer sitting on your desk running software, as opposed to an expensive robot which has to take on what is often a very difficult technical challenge in terms of trying to replicate human visual perception and dexterity and so forth. So a great many white-collar jobs going forward are really going to be susceptible to this. So what we see here is how this is already having an impact on college graduates in the United States. You can see that over the last decade, the earnings for people with college degrees has actually gone into decline. And again, this is to some extent at odds with the conventional view that a college degree is more and more important. And that continues to be true. People who graduate from college or university are doing much better than people who don't. But the uncomfortable truth is that distance in between the two groups is largely because opportunities for people that don't have that university degree are really in collapse. it's not because things are fantastic for the people that do graduate from university. In fact, what you see is that their incomes are actually going into decline. And again, I think a big part of the reason is that machines and algorithms are climbing the skills ladder, and they're impacting a lot of those more skilled jobs now. So another point that I think is really critically important, and it's something that has not so far gotten a lot of attention, but it's something that I've written quite a lot about in both of my books, is that this is something that obviously has an important impact on individuals and on the fabric of society. When people lose their job or they don't have an income, that's an important social issue. But beyond that, it's also an important economic issue. Capitalism and the market economy in general has a great need for huge numbers of consumers that have the ability to buy the products and services that are created. That's really what drives demand in the market economy. We need those people out there that have the ability to buy what's being produced. And without that, we really run the risk that we can get into a kind of downward economic spiral where businesses literally can't find enough customers that are capable of buying what they're producing. And I think that this is going to be kind of a looming problem in the future. It ties in closely with the whole concept of inequality, which has been increasing in all advanced countries. And you can think of that in terms of someone like Bill Gates. Imagine, Bill Gates as a billionaire has, in theory, an infinite amount of purchasing power. He can buy anything. But the reality, of course, is he's not going to just go out and buy and buy and buy. Bill Gates is not going to buy 1,000 automobiles. He's not going to buy 1,000 smartphones. He's definitely not going to sit down and buy or eat 1,000 restaurant meals. So you can see that as this ongoing process of inequality essentially takes purchasing power from 1,000 average people and concentrates it into the hands of one very wealthy person, that really takes demand out of the economy. It makes the whole system less vibrant, and really increases the danger of economic stagnation and even a downward spiral going forward. And I think there's some evidence to suggest that this may be an important trend already. What you see here is a graph of what's happened in the United States since recovery from the economic crisis. And this is a graph comparing retail sales with corporate profits. And what you see is that corporate profits have been pulling away from sales. In other words, corporations have been doing phenomenally well. They've had historic levels of profitability. They're earning more than ever, but those earnings are predominantly coming from cost cutting, from efficiency improvements, very often from eliminating workers. They are not coming about, for the most part, because corporations are selling more stuff. And that, clearly is something that's not sustainable. You cannot have a future in which profitability in big companies comes only from cutting costs. There's a limit to how much you can do that. Eventually, if you want to have continued prosperity and continued profitability, you've got to be able to sell more. In order to sell more, there have to be consumers out there that are capable of buying what you're selling. So I really think that this is a critical issue that we all need to think more about, and will, become increasingly important in the future. So then the final thing we come to is, what exactly should we do about all of this? And I think that fundamentally we're going to face a choice. We can imagine a very utopian future. We can imagine a future where no one has to do a job that they really hate. No one has to do a job that's particularly dangerous or unpleasant, where machines and smart algorithms and so forth take over all of this work. And as a result, people have a lot more time. They have a lot more ability to focus on things that they find genuinely rewarding. They have the ability to find work that helps them to grow. They can spend more time with their families or more time on leisure activities and so forth. So that's all a very optimistic scenario. It's something that techno-optimists, people that in Silicon Valley will talk about a lot. It's a great idea that we could move into a future like that. But I think the obvious thing to understand is that we can only have that kind of utopian, optimistic future if we solve this distributional problem. People are not going to have a great future if they don't have an income. And if we don't adapt to this new reality and ensure that people have an income from somewhere, then I think we're looking at a much more negative, perhaps even dystopian outcome. We're going to have inequality on steroids. We're going to have people under tremendous economic stress. We're going to have people that are genuinely worried about their futures, their ability to support their family, to pay their rent. And this is going to be a particular problem in the United States, where we, really don't have a social safety net that is comparable to what you see in most other industrialized countries, like Australia, for example. So this could potentially be a huge problem if we don't adapt to it. So the question is, how do we do that? And I think that in the short run, we clearly need to enhance our safety net across the board. I mean, whether you totally buy into this concept or not, I think most people would agree that things are moving faster and faster. A lot of opportunities are going to evaporate. People will have a hard time keeping up, and people will get into trouble, and they will need additional help. We need a better safety net. But going forward, even that may not be sufficient. We need to move to something entirely radical, and I think that the best idea is some form of guaranteed income. The idea being that you really decouple the income from the traditional job so that everyone has access to some sort of a minimal livable income, even if they can't find a traditional job. And that is, an extraordinarily radical idea. Even here, I'm sure it is. In Europe, it would be radical. In the United States, I have to say that it is, just virtually unthinkable, given the politics of the moment. I mean, if you follow the news. So, I mean, that's the paradox, is that in one sense, it's unthinkable. In the other sense, I think that it is, to a large extent, almost inevitable that we have to move in that direction if we want to have a successful future. So that's really the whole point of this, is to begin a conversation about this. I think it's critical that people begin to think about this and talk about this. And the hope is that as we have that conversation, we can move to a future where we find a way to adapt so that all of this remarkable progress that we're going to see over the next couple of decades results in prosperity that is shared broadly. So that everyone in our society, to some extent, will benefit from all of this remarkable progress, as opposed to just having it be the top few people at the top, the top most wealthy people. And that's the real risk that we face. And so I think that's the conversation that we really need to start having now. Thank you very much.
So we now have time for some questions and discussion with Martin. There are a couple of microphones here in the aisle of the theatre, and so if you'd like to ask a question, perhaps you could make your way to one of those. While you're doing that, I might just start by asking Martin to give us an example of a specific example of a technology on the immediate horizon that is likely to making those kinds of changes.
Well, there are many examples. One that I worry about a lot is fast food. I mean, and those are not particularly skilled, desirable jobs, but the reality is that millions and millions of people rely on those jobs to a large extent, especially in the United States, again, where we don't have a great social safety net. They are the jobs of last resort. They're almost, something that has always existed for people to do when they don't have another choice. And yet we see there's a company in San Francisco that's working on a hamburger robot that will crank out about 400 hamburgers per hour. And whether it's that particular company or not, I think it's inevitable that more automation is coming to fast food. It's probably coming to Starbucks. It's going to be across the food service industry. It's also coming to the retail industry. These jobs that people really rely on are going to begin to disappear and get harder and harder to come by. And at the same time, of course, we've got algorithms coming for the higher skilled jobs. So I think that it's really a big risk in terms of our employment situation.
Mm-hmm. Over here, we have some questions. Yes, it'll be on. Okay. Keep it on.
Capitalism seems to be based on two things: the connection of the owner to the labourers, and the owner needing the labourers, and then growth. And I just wondered on your thoughts of what the disconnection of ownership and labourers means for our hold on this idea of capitalism, and whether that changes the way that we organise our economies.
Right, I think that's a critically important point. And as I was saying, capitalism relies on consumers. We have to have people out there who can buy what's being produced. And historically, the mechanism that gets income or purchasing power into nearly all of the consumers out there has been jobs. So it's been a nice process where everything works out, that essentially there's a cycle, right? Money goes from consumers to businesses, and then money goes from businesses back to consumers through the mechanism of jobs. But the whole idea here is that a great many of those jobs are going to disappear. And so that mechanism that distributes purchasing power is going to break down. And what we need to do is we need to fix that. We need to find another way to get that purchasing power into the hands of consumers. And that, if you sit down and think about it for even a minute, it's not hard to figure out how to do that. You just give people the money.
We are a festival of dangerous ideas, people.
Right. But politically, of course, it's an unfathomable, staggering challenge. So it's, if it were a computer programming, a computer simulation, you could fix it very easily, just make a tweak. But in real society, finding the political capital to make a change like that is just a stupendous challenge.
Does it change incentives to work as well if you just give people money? I know that's two questions.
Yeah, I mean, the incentive to work has always been critical because we have needed people to work. I mean, if we move into a future where machines do more, the incentive for people to work may be less important. So we actually might have to worry a little bit less about that.
Mm. One more from here, and then we'll come to the microphone. One more from microphone number one.
Yeah, it's a similar sort of thing. I guess you're talking about the death of capitalism. That's what it was talking about here, and move to socialism or something where people don't need to work and the robots are doing all the jobs so everyone can go to the pub.
Well, that's the idea. And very often when I talk about a guaranteed income, people say, oh, that's socialism. But it's actually not. A guaranteed income is something that has been proposed by conservatives in the past. For example, Friedrich Hayek, who is a kind of iconic conservative figure, was a big proponent of a guaranteed income. So it's not socialism. Socialism is when the government takes over the whole economy, basically, and runs everything, and you have central planning and all of that. I don't think that's a good idea. It's failed dramatically in the past. And so what I'm talking about is actually a way to adapt capitalism that gets us essentially to the same place where people would have a lot more freedom while machines do most of the work.
It's like a hybrid between the two.
To some extent, yeah.
Thank you.
Microphone number two.
G'day, Martin. Thanks for a really fascinating talk. Just to kind of develop the idea that was put before, given that robots are a kind of capital rather than labour, would you see a solution to the problem as being, workers' control over the firm and being able to decide how those machines would then be deployed? It's not inevitable that we just create a class of robots that do us out of jobs. These are active decisions that are being made by a management class. So have you explored any of those kinds of ideas, or do you think there's just no hope because of the pace of technological progress through Moore's law and that kind of thing?
Well, I mean that's definitely something that I've heard a lot about. People have proposed that one solution would be to have more employee ownership. Average people would have a greater stake in capitalism and in the machines. The problem with that is that essentially what you're talking about is redistributing capital. Redistributing ownership, and I think that I think that's probably even more politically toxic than redistributing income. I mean, now you're talking about taking property from people who now own it, and it's a small number of people, granted, and then giving it to a larger number of people. I think that's probably a bigger challenge than simply doing the same thing with income. So I think that the income scenario may be more workable.
Microphone number one.
My first question has been covered off in the first few, so I'll move on to my second. It seems with algorithms taking over even white-collar jobs, all we're left with potentially is emotions, creativity, and vision. Can you see algorithms muscling on those?
I would never say never. I mean, for now, I think that if you want to ask the question, what jobs are safe? Yes, I think it's jobs that have that genuine human element, more emotion, more interaction with people, jobs that require creativity and so forth. Those are the areas that currently are sort of beyond machines. But there are already examples. There's lots of research being done into emotional machines that can respond to people and detect their emotions and so forth. There are algorithms that can do counseling, that can help people with their problems, at least in theory. So, this is already happening, and I think that if you project far enough into the future, there's really just nothing that you can say with absolute certainty that machines and algorithms won't be able to do.
Got a question here at microphone number 2. Perhaps someone can... Oh, good.
This is really useful. First of all, 100% unemployment is a great aspiration in my mind, so we should be working towards that. And are governments taking your message on board? Because all I hear is growth, jobs and austerity. I don't hear anyone take into account this.
For the most part, no. I mean, I haven't heard much of that either. I certainly don't, you know, I spend most of my time in the United States. I certainly don't hear the politicians there talking about it. I hear them talking about immigration mostly. And you know, that's one danger of all this is that you know, you will see demagogues rise and point to, you know, we have a tendency to blame everything on some other group of people. This idea that it's this nebulous technology, something that we can't quite wrap our minds around, that is really creating this structural change, is hard for a lot of people. They'd much rather point to some people somewhere that they can blame. So for the most part, no. I mean, there definitely is more attention to this. There are events like this where we're talking about it, which I think is incredibly useful, but it hasn't really penetrated the political structure from what I've seen.
Yeah, I've spoken to work colleagues about this, and they all think I'm crazy, like that this is a really far-off fantasy.
I think you need to suggest some, give them some suggested reading, perhaps. Microphone number 1.
Yeah, thanks, Martin, for a great talk. We've heard a lot about open letters from Stephen Hawkins and people about that existential threat, and a bit fascinated with sort of psychology and how AI will differ from humans. We see one side of the spectrum, you've got people doing a lot of evil in the world and a lot of people doing a lot of great in the world. You've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about this. What would be the motivation for robots of the world becoming, I don't know, a threat to humanity?
Well, so the question about AI, artificial intelligence, and how that might work with robots.
Right, that's something that's been getting a terrific amount of attention. As you know, some very high-profile people, including Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk and so forth, have warned that the machines are eventually going to wake up and take over, and perhaps at that point they won't have much use for us. What I would say is that, you know, based on my conversations with people really doing research into artificial intelligence, I don't think that that's something we need to worry about anytime really soon. I think that in the near term, meaning over the next couple of decades, the issue that I'm focusing on here in terms of the economic impact is going to be much more important. I don't think we're really close to, you know, machines that can become conscious and think like human beings, as far as I know. I mean, you know, maybe in some secret lab there's something happening that I don't know about, but
DARPA,
you know, so I don't worry about that at all in the immediate future. But on the other hand, I also would not dismiss that as ridiculous. I mean, it's eventually, I think, quite possibly a real concern. I mean, it's completely unpredictable. Some people think that that's impossible, it will never happen. I wouldn't say that. I think that anything is probably possible, and we may have machines that can think like human beings, and most people believe that that happens, they will soon become super intelligent. They will be, you know, 1,000 times smarter than we are. We will be like comparing us to insects or something, possibly. If that happens, then, I mean, you know, yeah, the game is up. It would be, as Stephen Hawking said, it would be the biggest thing that has ever happened in human history. There's no doubt about that. So I would say don't worry about it today, but don't stop worrying about it completely.
And we might take a final question from microphone number 2.
Thank you again for a great talk, Martin. The idea of artificial intelligence, the type that you've been talking of, and augmented intelligence, so computers actually helping people to do their jobs, is there not an interim period where augmented intelligence and sort of work for play is going to create a lot more jobs, maybe in the next sort of 50 to 100 years? So we won't see this massive drop-off initially, although obviously the lower skilled jobs will probably disappear quite quickly.
You know, I think that there will certainly be some opportunities, but you know, as I said, what we see is that these new things that are created are not, there just aren't huge numbers of them. I mean, one of the things that I believe is true, if you really sit down and think of it, is that most of the work in the economy is fairly routine. I mean, most people come to work and they face the same kinds of challenges again and again. Not rote repetitive, but, you know, predictable based on what they've done in the past. And, you know, when you look at technologies like machine learning, it becomes evident that a lot of that is going to go away. And the question is, will there be enough genuinely non-routine, creative, blue sky thinking jobs to employ everyone? I don't think so. I mean, it seems unlikely to me.
Before we conclude, I just want to ask for your response to something. I mean, I think we've seen very interesting and unsettling developments in the Chinese economy in recent weeks. And in your book, you talk about a recent visit to China and something which I'm just going to quote. Foxconn, which makes consumer electronics for Apple and other companies, plans to automate about 70% of factory work within 3 years and already has a fully robotic factory in Chengdu. Most of our conversation today has been about the impact of this in the kind of economy that we have, a developed and mixed economy like we have in Australia or in the United States. The implications of something like that happening in that space of time, within 3 years, what has been a huge source of employment.
That's right. I mean, I think that this is going to be tremendously important in China. I mean, in developed countries, it's going to be mostly about the service sector. It's often going to be algorithms replacing workers. But of course, in China, I mean, actual robots in factories are going to be a huge issue. And it's incredible. You see with Foxconn, I was kind of amazed to learn that they've actually got a factory that operates with the lights turned out, with no one inside the factory. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. And I mean, when you think of how many people there are in China and the extent of their workforce, I mean, it's fairly terrifying to imagine, you know, massive unemployment there. The other thing in China is that they need to rebalance their economy. They've got this economy right now which is driven almost entirely by investment, building things, roads and bridges and housing and whole cities and so forth. But they've got to rebalance that in favor of you know, actually having people buy stuff domestically and drive their economy that way, which is the way it is in the West. In order to do that, they need to raise the incomes of their workers, and yet they're kind of having to make this transition in a robotic age where these technologies are so much more advanced than when, you know, countries like the United States or Australia went through that same transition. So I think it's a tremendous challenge for them. I would also say that, you know, this is a big issue not just for China, which is very far along, but also for other emerging countries, because the traditional path to prosperity for poor countries has always been to build factories and employ lots of low-wage workers. And it's looking like, as we look forward, that could well evaporate. That path to prosperity could just kind of disappear. So you really wonder about the poorest countries in Africa, for example, or in other parts of Asia that really have not, you know, made any progress at all yet. How are they going to make that transition in the future? What's the hope going to be for them if, in fact, we don't need factories that employ huge numbers of unskilled people anymore? So it's a huge issue for the whole world.
On that fascinating and unsettling note, dangerous people, we are forced to conclude. Martin will be in the foyer signing copies of his book, which I cannot recommend too highly. Father's Day presents unbought, get out there. And Martin is also speaking in another session tomorrow if you're fortunate enough to be able to come to that. Thank you for coming, for your interest and for your questions, and thank Martin.